Please be seated. We are continuing our series in the book of Matthew, part 1, titled The Royal Family. And this week we it's all royal family, that's the whole point. But this week is one of the first times where we get that clue from what we're looking at, from the passage we're looking at, an actual call out to the fact that the people we're looking at are part of the royal family of Israel, which is pretty cool. So we're looking at Matthew 1, verse 5, and we'll be looking specifically at Boaz and Ruth. So Matthew chapter 1, verse 5 says, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse. We're going to spend most of our time in the book of Ruth. And I can't actually read from the back. That's why I keep looking up there. It's just really tiny on that screen. We're going to be in the book of Ruth this morning, and I'm really excited about that. It's a fantastic book. If you have not read it, you should. I say that about all Scripture, obviously, as a pastor, but this is actually a really, really super compelling story. It's the kind that you would expect would be just made for cinema. And it's extremely compelling and intricate, and it's a love story. Imagine that. So you put all these things together, and that's what we're looking at. But what's fascinating about the book of Ruth is that while there is a romantic love story kind of in there, it's really about the love that these people have for God's people. Which is really cool. You don't get a lot of stories about that. What we saw last week kind of almost gets us to the point of where this story is. So last week, Ben talked about Rahab, and Rahab is the mother of Boaz, who we'll be looking at this week. So you're only a generation removed, but a lot happens with God's people during that generation. So when Rahab was introduced to Israel, they were just at the front edge of entering the promised land. By the time this story happens, Joshua, who was leading Israel at that time, has died. And there's no leader to rise up and rule Israel. And so then you go into the time of the book of Judges. And so this book of Ruth actually mentions that in the days when the judges ruled is how this book begins. So it's set during that time period in Israel's history. And what often follows in the book of Judges is a description of things not going well. God's people forget how to follow God, and God has to remind them through some pretty terrible things. In this case, in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, it says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, which is a pretty terrible thing. But all of this story is sort of a contrast to what we find in the book of Judges itself. So in our Bibles, we have Joshua, then Judges, then Ruth. Ruth doesn't happen after the book of Judges. It happens kind of at the beginning of the book of Judges. But it's a contrast. So there's all these things we see in the book of Judges that are really terrible about God's people not remembering what it looks like to follow God. This book shows when a few of God's people did remember what it looked like to follow God. And at that, we see somebody who wasn't one of God's people, who becomes one of God's people, and realizes what it looks like to follow him. It's really cool. I am going to try to weave things together in a way that tells the story of Ruth as it unfolds, but also traces our themes from the book of Matthew. So let's look at those first, just as a reminder. So the three themes that we've seen in the opening of Matthew's gospel are God's faithful fulfillment of his promises, his omnipresence. He's everywhere. He's all over these situations. And God's redemptive work, how he takes some really awful things and turns it around. And all three of those themes are present in this story as they have been in all the others. Let's go to who's Boaz and Ruth. I always want to start with Ruth because she's the one whose name goes on the book. But in the genealogy, it's Boaz and Ruth. Who are Boaz and Ruth? Well, we're going to start with the bitter beginning. And that actually comes from the text. So there's this woman. Before that, there's a man. There's always both. So there's a man from Bethlehem in Judah, and his name was Elimelech, and he was from the tribe of Judah. He was married to a woman named Naomi. And because of this famine, they decided to leave Israel. They were like, we got to go somewhere. So let's go to Moab. It's across the river, and there's plenty of food over there. Let's move there. And they had two sons, and they went with their two sons, and they moved to Moab. And while they were there, their sons got married to Moabite women. One of them was named Orpah, and the other one was named Ruth. Well, while they were there about 10 years, Elimelech died. So that wasn't good. And then the two sons died. That wasn't good either. And all of this is in the opening paragraph of the book of Ruth. So there's this beginning that's like really hard. At first there's a famine, then they flee the famine, they find food, but we don't know what the cause of death for any of them was. We just know that these three men died. And so then the three women are left all alone. And Naomi is alone in a foreign land. Well, about that time, she hears that there's food in Israel again. So she says to her two daughters-in-law, hey, this has been rough. I'm going to go home. You go back to your homes, to your families here, and hopefully things will go better for all of us. And the daughters-in-law are reluctant to leave her. And so they both offer to go with her. And she presses them further and says, look, seriously, I have nothing to offer you. Even if I could get married again and have another child, that you're not going to wait for that child to get old enough to remarry. You just need to go back to where you began and try to find something there. And so the one of them, Orpah, does. She says, she weeps, and it's a bitter parting, but she goes back home. But Ruth refuses. And Ruth sticks with Naomi. And we'll come to that soon. But I want to give us some context for those things that open up the book, because these are not things that have the same significance for us as they did for them. So the first is some of just the names associated with this stuff. I know sometimes that's not exciting, but this is kind of neat. It's part of how this is such a well put together story. So they're from Bethlehem, and Bethlehem literally means house of bread. But there wasn't food. There was a famine. They leave the house of bread because there's no bread. Elimelech means my God is king. That's the name of Naomi's husband who dies. But the book of Judges has this refrain over and over and over again that at that time there was no king in Israel. That's why the judges ruled. And so at this time, when there is no king in Israel, this man whose name means the Lord is king, my God is king, he leaves the land that the Lord promised to his people and goes to this other place to seek refuge. So there's a lot of irony in that opening. Additionally, specifically the people he went to, the Moabites, have a very not good history with Israel at this point in time. There is a number of things that they had done. Oh, I skipped a part. The famine, of course. We're going to read some verses about the famine. I don't remember what they are. The references will show up when we get to the slides. So let's go to the next thing. And I have to read this way. So this is part of God's promises. So I mentioned through this series, God's faithful to fulfill his promises. One of the promises is not a good promise, and it's this one. If after all this you will not listen to me, I will punish you for your sins 7 times over. I will break down your stubborn pride and make the sky above you like iron and the ground beneath you like bronze. Your strength will be spent in vain because your soil will not yield its crops, nor will the trees of your land yield their fruit. That's from Leviticus 26, 18 through 20. And it's said similarly in Deuteronomy 28, 23, and 24 as well, in that long series of blessings and curses for following God and for not following God. So they didn't follow God, and God said, okay, I need to remind you of how this works, and he dries things up. And instead of being reminded how things work and turning to God, this family just runs away. They go to a different land where the people serve a different God. Okay, now the Moabites specifically. There's a bunch of stuff that the Moabites do, and I'll get to that verse after I set it up. So first, Moab as a people starts from Lot's daughters. And that's a really sordid story. And if you know that story, I've said enough. And if you don't know that story, I'm not going to talk about that this week. We don't need to talk about that this week, but you can go look it up. It's a very unpleasant beginning, and it's a big part of why the Israelites are not fans of the Moabites. But then, when Israel's coming out of Egypt and they're headed to the Promised Land, they need to travel through the territory of Moab to get there. And so they send some messengers to the king of Moab and say, hey, we're just trying to get through to this other place. Would you give us, we'll pay for anything that we damage along the way. If we drink any water, we'll pay you for it. Like whatever resources we need along the journey, we'll make sure we compensate you for it. We just need to get through. We're not here to cause you any harm. And by that point, they'd had a number of encounters with people that they had to battle with. And so there was a reputation that Israel was not the nicest group to have passing through your territory. The king of Moab returns a response and says, absolutely not. I will not let you enter my territory, and becomes quite hostile towards them. So then their journey gets extended. Eventually, though, they still end up having to go through part of this territory of Moab. And when that happens, the king of Moab hires a guy named Balaam to curse them. And that's an interesting story, too. It involves a donkey speaking. It's fascinating. And God prevents this man from being able to curse Israel. Instead, he keeps speaking blessings upon Israel. But that's part of the story, is that the Moabite king wanted to curse Israel and went to great lengths to try to make that happen. And then finally, the Moabites seduce a bunch of Israelites as they're in the plains of Moab waiting to go into Israel, and that leads to this whole big punishment for them that God rains down on them. It's a whole big thing. And so Moses, in the end of Deuteronomy, says this that we're going to go ahead and read. It says, no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. So why? Well, they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt, and they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in Aram Naharaim, to pronounce a curse on you. However, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. Do not seek a treaty of friendship with them as long as you live. So, this is the people that this family flees to. And then marries their sons to. It's not really how things were supposed to go. Then they die, and there's this other move. When she gets back home, the women of her hometown in Bethlehem, they greet her. Oh, welcome back. Good to see you. And they call her by her name, Naomi. And she says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because Mara means bitter, and Naomi means pleasant. She's like, I am not a pleasant person anymore. I am bitter because of all that I've been through. So that's our bitter beginning. That's how the stage is set for the story of Boaz and Ruth. Now, we haven't gotten to Boaz yet, but his background, it's hard to tell. It's one of those things that we have to kind of fill in some blanks. Because when he finally does interact in a positive way with Ruth, he expresses surprise that she would have any interest in him. He finds himself an older bachelor without any prospects. We don't know why. We don't know how. He just is. As I was reading through it again this week, at one point, I was challenged with that question of Boaz's background, and I went, this is like one of those Hallmark movies where you have the guy who's in his 40s, and he's single, and we don't know why, he just is, and he's really good looking, and he's successful in life, and he is just waiting for that perfect person to come along. That's Boaz. We don't know the backstory. We just know that somehow or another he's made it to this place in life where he's available and nobody's interested. So there's our bitter beginning. The next place that we're going to go to, though, is the glimmers of hope. So we have this Moabite woman, Ruth, hanging on to her Israelite mother-in-law, despite no real reason to do that. And so they get back, and they're like, well, now what? What are we going to do? And so Naomi can't really work. She's that point in life. But Ruth still can. So Naomi tells Ruth, look, why don't you go out into the fields and glean behind the workers? That was a practice that was common in the ancient world for poor people to do, is to follow behind the workers who were harvesting in the field and to pick up the stuff they leave behind. And it was even commanded that Israel would be kind to people who are doing those things, that you should not harvest all the way up to the corners of your field, leave a little bit behind for the poor people, that kind of thing. So she goes out and finds a field, and it happens to be the field of Boaz. And actually that chapter, before they talk about the gleaning, it says, now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing, is what I have in the NIV, but it's really a man of valor, is what that word means, from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And so then Ruth says to Naomi, okay, let me go do this. I'll get some grain wherever somebody lets me glean. And she says, okay, go ahead. Go glean. Well, it turns out she finds this field of Boaz without knowing whose field it is or his connections to the family or anything like that. That's just the field that she finds herself in. And Boaz sees her and asks his workers, who's this woman? And they said, oh, well, this is the Moabite woman, Ruth, who came back with Naomi. She's gleaning. And Boaz is impressed with her commitment to her mother-in-law. I skipped the commitment part. We have that verse for the screen. When she commits to Naomi, this is what Ruth says. Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." That's a pretty strong commitment. I'd be impressed if I heard that story, and it's a small town, and so that story got around before Ruth made it to the fields. And so Boaz goes, "Oh, that woman, that's amazing. Well, okay." And he instructs his workers to be kind to her, to make sure that she has everything that she needs, to make sure that she has water to drink, to make sure that nobody harasses her. Pretty nice guy. Okay. So she starts gleaning, and then she comes home with what she acquired, which is a lot. It's way more than they needed for their own food. And so Naomi says, "Wow, how did this work out? And whose field were you in?" And Ruth says, "Some guy named Boaz." And Naomi goes, "Oh, he's part of our family. He's one of the people who can redeem our situation. He can make sure that the field that my husband owned stays in the family. He can make sure that we're taken care of. So keep going back to his field as long as you're allowed to." And so she does. And things go pretty well. Well, once the harvest is completed, they have to process what they've harvested. And so they go to the threshing floor to do the threshing. And Naomi decides that this is a good opportune moment to approach Boaz about the situation that they're in and his relationship with them, with the family. Now, we interacted with this concept of the threshing floor before in the story of Judah and Tamar. It's a place where there's a lot of partying, a lot of celebrating, because they've come to realize just how much they've harvested, that this is going to be good. It's the kind of the end of the cycle. And so that's part of the backdrop of why Naomi picked that time. With Judah, it was a time when his discernment was low. And with Boaz, I think that's kind of her hope. But as the story unfolds, what we see is that Boaz is actually just very wise. So he sends Ruth and says, "Look, here's what you got to do. When everybody goes to bed and it's dark, make sure you pay attention to where Boaz is laying down. Go over there and take the blanket off his feet, and then lay down by his feet. And then do, whatever he tells you to do." Okay. So she does. She uncovers his feet, and sure enough, he wakes up and says, "Who's there?" And she says, "This is who I am, and I need you to spread your wings over me," which can be a picture of the blanket, but also a picture of protection. It's an image that's often used for God spreading his wings over Israel, this idea of protecting like a mother bird. And Boaz realizes that this is actually a request to not just take care of her that evening, but permanently. It's basically a proposal of marriage, which is very unusual in that society and that time and everything else. This is not how this is supposed to work. But Boaz still sees this as a really good thing that Ruth is doing. So he says this incredible thing to her. He says, where is it? It's in chapter 3. It's in the section of verse 10 and following. There's a part where he says, everybody is going to recognize who you are. Here it goes. In verse 11. Don't be afraid. I'll do all that you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character, which is actually, it's the feminine form of that phrase used for Boaz. It's a woman of valor. And it actually connects really well to Proverbs 31, the description of the woman of valor there. And in some ancient collections of Scripture, the book of Ruth follows the book of Proverbs. And so then you go from this description of a woman of valor to then this description of a woman of valor. This is what Boaz is saying, is basically you are the type of woman that God wants women to be. And everybody in town knows that, and so I am going to do what I can to take care of your situation. There's a little bit of a twist, because the person who was next in line to redeem the family property was not Boaz, and he knew that. And so he says, I'll take care of it though. One way or another, we'll sort this out tomorrow. He gives her instructions, he gives her more grain, sends her home, and the women just have to wait. And now the shift scenes from what's going on with the women to what's going on with the men. So the next day, Boaz goes to the city gate where official business was conducted, and he waits for this other guy to come along. We don't get his name. It's really fun. What's used for him literally means like Mr. So-and-so. So Mr. So-and-so comes along, and Boaz stops him as he's passing through the gate and says, hey, I've got some, in fact, that's what he says. He says, hey. He doesn't say his name. He says, hey. And he gets his attention, and the guy I have some business. And he come sit down, and then he gathers a bunch of the town elders, and they have an official proceeding. And so Boaz starts with some speeches, and he says, here's the situation. The land that belonged to Elimelech is in jeopardy of passing out of the family because Naomi needs to sell it. She's destitute. She's got to do something to provide for herself. So she's putting the land up for sale, and if anybody buys it outside the family, that's going to be a problem. We want to keep it within the family. You're next in line. Do you want to redeem this property for the family? And the guy goes, sure, I can do that. And then Boaz says, okay, well, you know that that Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of Elimelech's son, she comes with the land. And the guy goes, I can't do that. That would jeopardize my own family and situation. If you want to redeem it, go ahead, but I don't want to do that. And there's a sandal exchange that happens and all this stuff that makes it official. And so then Boaz announces to the elders what he plans to do. Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon, so the family farm, as it were. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses. And they say, yes, we're witnesses. This is to me one of the most fascinating parts of this story, what the elders say in response. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. These are names that we don't usually see pop up, and yet here they are in this positive context as part of a blessing, and they're names that we've learned their stories recently. And we know why they're not often used as a blessing, and yet they were because of how the Lord had used those families to that point, and so many in that town were part of that lineage, which is pretty cool. Okay, so they get married, and lo and behold, despite having been married for 10 years to Naomi's son and not having any kids, pretty quickly, Ruth becomes pregnant. And they have a son. And everybody rejoices. And the women of the town say, Naomi, the Lord has turned everything around to you, and this daughter-in-law of yours who loves you, she's better than 7 sons for you because of what she's done. It's amazing. Really sweet, really incredible. All of this is part of how God redeems their situation. This is the redemption. The field gets redeemed. The family farm stays in the family. With buying the farm, this man also says, I want to continue the line so that it won't die off. We learned about that whole process back with Judah and Tamar and how important that was. So here it comes back again, and here's somebody who actually stands up and does what needs to be done instead of shirking responsibility. In fact, it seems, so you get these two different weird laws together. The redemption of the property is different than the lineage thing. So you've got both of them working together in this one situation, and Boaz is seemingly outside of what those laws actually require. So he's able to do what he's doing, but he doesn't have to do what he's doing. But he steps up. He recognizes the need for somebody to take responsibility and says, yes, I'll do it. I'll be the responsible person in this situation, and I'll see it as a blessing to be able to do it, and not as a pain like this other guy did. It's just an incredible story. And so even though he makes it clear through the story that he's focused on continuing the line for Elimelech and his sons, what happens at the end is that the child is credited not to Elimelech's line, but to the line of Boaz. That the Lord looks on, and the people of the town, everybody looks on what Boaz did and says, you know what? This is the man whose legacy should live on through these children. Not the ones who kind of created the mess to begin with. And so at the end of the book, you have a genealogy. This then is the family line of Perez. And it goes through Perez all the way up to Boaz, all the way up to Obed, who is their son, that he born by Ruth. And then Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David. And the book ends with that word, Jesse, the father of David. How's that for an ending of a book? A genealogy. But the whole point is clearly, like, it starts by saying, well, this all happened back when the judges ruled, which is a way of knowing that this story was written when that was no longer the case. It ends with this genealogy that takes us to David, which means that it's written at least by David was born by then, and we knew who he was. That this story is recognizing that this is the family of the king. That these people end up becoming the royal family. Not only do they save the family farm, but ultimately I'm going to have to do the math on this. So their great-grandson, David, ends up saving the country. So all of this is part of God's redemptive work in this whole family. That this Moabite woman, who shouldn't have been allowed to enter the assembly of God's people, is brought in and seen to be more of a true Israelite than her father-in-law. That Boaz recognizes that, and he, being the son of Rahab, goes, you know what? It's okay that she's not an Israelite. I know that God can work through the faith of people like this to do amazing things. And so he is part of doing basically what his own father did in bringing in this foreign woman into the family of God, the community of God, and seeing that redemptive work in her life. It's amazing. Ruth has no reason to leave behind what she knew, and yet she does in such a dramatic way, to such a, the oath that like nothing, even death will not separate you from me. It's an incredible thing that she does. That all of these things are part of how God redeems the situation, but not just for this family, but for the nation. remember that this is a contrast to what's going on in the book of Judges around them. That for the most part, the people of Israel are not following God. For the most part, they're not showing this kind of character. For the most part, things are really bad. And even in the midst of a community of like really awfulness, God's still got these people who are doing the right things, who are following Him. He's still redeeming these people's lives and their situations, so that it becomes then a picture for how we should expect that no matter what's going on around us, no matter how bad things are, God's still at work. God's still transforming lives, still redeeming situations. He's still taking the really awful, the bitter, the famine and the deaths and the estrangement and all these things, and He's taking those things and turning them around and bringing blessing out of it somehow. It's amazing. It's an amazing story just to read. It's an amazing thing to reflect on how it plays into the nation's history. But it's an amazing thing to point to God's faithfulness to His people, even in the darkest times. It's incredible. This book becomes an illustration of what God's love for His people looks like when it's lived out by His people. So there's a Hebrew word that shows up all over the place, hesed, that describes God's love for His people, His commitment to them. And then this word shows up all over this book to describe what's going on with Ruth and her relationship with Naomi, and Boaz and his faithfulness in doing what he does to redeem these women and the land and all those things. That this is what it looks like to be a person who follows the God who is this way. So there's our arc, there's our whole story. There's so much more detail. It's so good. I encourage you to read it. But how does all of this, how do Boaz and Ruth point us to Jesus? Well, the start is the start. That in that suffering, in that time of bitterness, to recognize that Jesus sees all of that and understands it. We know that He also experienced bitterness in life. He also suffered severely. He also saw how that suffering could be redeemed. He did that work. It was done in His life, but then He does it in our lives as well. That this is a reminder of the type of work that God does. Second, Jesus came to redeem people from every tongue, from every tribe, from every nation. That there's some intentionality along the way in God inserting these people from other groups into not just the community of Israel, but specifically the royal family. That the Messiah comes through a Moabite woman. That's amazing. It's a sign of God's desire to include all kinds of people and not just specific kinds. Third, Jesus is the true heir of Judah. So Obed, their son, becomes an heir in the line of Judah. He becomes an heir to this property. He becomes an heir to that family, all those things. He becomes then the grandfather of David. David becomes the king. But then ultimately, Jesus is the true king. He's the true man of valor, the true Israelite. He's all these things that Ruth and Boaz were and more. And that's how all of this it just shows us a glimpse of who Jesus is and how He is who He is. So as I mentioned, if you want to learn more about God's work in the life of Boaz and Ruth, I'd encourage you to read the book of Ruth. It's 4 chapters. you could probably do it in less time than I took up this morning. But it's really fantastic, and having some of this history might help you guide yourself through it along the way. There's lots of other details that might get confusing and lead you on all kinds of explorations of, but what's this, and why is this that way? And it's really fascinating. But even if you just read it through once or listen to it once, I'm sure that you'll find it captivating. It's really, really fantastic. Well, with all of that behind us, let's move to our time of reflection and reflect on these things that we've seen in the story of Boaz and Ruth, of God's work of redemption in their lives. The kind of God who does these things not just for them, but for people today too. And how he's at work in your life, or situations around you. Maybe there's some, whether it's bitterness in your life or someone else's close to you, to reflect on where might God enter in and be a part of redeeming even this situation. Maybe there's something else that God's doing that has nothing to do with what I've said. This is your time to reflect on those things. Take whatever posture you need. Addison and Sophie are going to come back up, and they're going to play a song. You can join in singing them if you know it and you want to, but it's really just meant to give you that time and space to be with God and to interact with Him on whatever it is that's going on in your life that you need to interact with Him on. And then we'll sing another song together after that.